The sun rose slowly over 29 Palms Marine Corps' base, painting the desert sand in shades of amber and gold. Heat shimmered off the asphalt and metal, a harsh reminder that the Marines stationed here trained not just for war, but for survival in environments that tested every fiber of endurance. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hall, the sniper commander of the 3rd Marine Battalion, strode across the base with the purposeful gait of a man who carried the weight of men and missions on his shoulders. His boots kicked up tiny clouds of dust as he approached the barracks, mentally reviewing the day's inspection schedule and deployment plans for his unit. It was during this routine morning patrol that someone stopped him dead in his tracks. Sitting alone on a low, concrete wall just beyond the parking lot, crouched in the shadow of a weathered supply crate, was an elderly man. His back was slightly hunched, his thin hands moving with astonishing precision over an M40 sniper rifle. Hawley noticed the meticulous care. Every joint polished, every bolt and screw examined and tightened, and the barrel glinting in the rising sunlight as though it had just come off the assembly line. What froze Hawley wasn't just the rifle, though the M40 was a model long retired from active service, but the unit patch sewn onto the man's faded jacket. The insignia was unmistakable. The Delta 9 Sniper Company, the elite unit Howell commanded now. His heart skipped a beat. How could it be possible? This unit had been restructured decades ago. Its Vietnam-era members were presumed dead, retired, or missing. And yet, here was one of them, sitting quietly, polishing a weapon that had once defined their legacy. Hawley slowed, calculating his approach. In his years as a Marine, he had faced ambushes, insurgents, and sniper fire, but nothing prepared him for the quiet intensity of an old man with a rifle and a story yet untold. He cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, instinctively using the military formality he had drilled into his men. "This area is restricted." The old man lifted his eyes, pale blue and startlingly sharp for someone his age. For a moment, Hawley could almost swear he recognized the gaze, though he had never met the man in his life. "It always was," the man said quietly, a faint smile curling at the edges of his lips, almost mocking, almost knowing. His voice was calm but carried an edge, like a soldier who had seen too many things no one else could imagine. Hale's instincts screamed caution. Every fiber of his training told him to call for backup, to approach carefully, to keep his hand on his sidearm. Yet there was something magnetic, almost hypnotic, about the man and that rifle. Hale's curiosity, something he had fought to suppress as a commander, began to stir. He stepped closer. "Your name?" Hawley asked, his voice steady despite the rapid beat of his heart. "James," the man replied. "James Dalton. You can call me Reaper." The name hit Hawley like a cold gust of wind. James Reaper Dalton. The very same man listed as missing in action in 1968 during a classified Vietnam mission that had gone mysteriously wrong. Hawley blinked, thinking it must be a coincidence. Perhaps a relative? Or someone who had borrowed the name. But the precision in the man's movements, the way he handled the M40, the patch, it all added up. His mind raced. "Sir, I'm reporting this," Hawley said slowly, instinctively reaching for his radio. Before he could speak, Dalton's gaze shifted to him, and Hawley froze. The calm, unwavering stare of a man who had seen death at point-blank range and survived was enough to make even a battle-hardened Marine hesitate. Dalton's voice was softer now, almost reflective. "You think I wandered in here by accident?" "No, son. I came here for a reason." "You just don't know it yet." Hall swallowed hard, forcing his hands to remain visible. He studied the old man, noting the subtle tremors in his fingers, the scars along his knuckles, the way his eyes flicked toward the insignia on his chest. There was history there, not just personal history, but the history of Delta 9, a unit that had left a mark on American military legend, one that Hal now realized he was standing beside. Overhead, a helicopter lifted off, the rotors kicking up a swirl of sand. Hale could hear the distant chatter of his men, preparing for training exercises, oblivious to the living ghost in their midst. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The desert heat, the distant hum of machinery, the smell of gun oil from Dalton's rifle, all of it combined into a surreal tableau. "Delta 9, Hale said, almost whispering, as if saying it aloud might make it vanish. You were part of Delta 9? Dalton nodded slowly. "A long time ago. They said I was dead. They said we all were. But death, well, it doesn't always come when they think it does. Not if you still have a job to finish." Hale felt a chill run down his spine. There was authority in the old man's words. Authority earned not through rank alone, but through survival, through the kind of experiences that no textbook could teach. He realized that this encounter, brief, silent, almost casual, was something far larger than a simple trespassing incident. "Why? Why are you here?" Hale asked, struggling to maintain the composure of a Marine officer. Dalton's eyes softened, though the edge remained. "Because the world forgot us. Because Delta 9 deserves to be remembered. And because someone needs to know the truth before it dies with us." Hale glanced at the rifle again. It gleamed under the morning sun, the stock polished to perfection, the barrel straight and true. Every detail of the weapon suggested decades of practice, care, and dedication, a craft that had survived time itself. In that moment, Hale understood. This was more than a visit from a retired veteran. This was a mission, still alive, carried by one man who refused to let history forget. He made a silent decision. No, he wouldn't call it in yet. Not until he understood what was happening. There were stories buried deep in the folds of military history, missions that had been erased, men who had been written out of records, sacrifices unacknowledged. And this man, Dalton, was the last living testament of one such story. For a moment, Hale and Dalton simply stood there, the desert wind whispering around them. Dust rose in thin plumes from the asphalt, the heat shimmering off the rifle's metal, the faint hum of distant engines filling the silence. Two Marines, separated by generations, yet united in understanding the weight of a mission that never truly ended. Finally, Hale spoke, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of reverence. "I'm Marcus Hall, Commander, Delta 9, and I don't know why, but I think we need to talk." Dalton nodded, a small smile breaking the stoic mask. "Good. It's about time someone from your generation listened." In that fleeting moment, under the harsh sun of 29 Palms, the past collided with the present, and neither man would ever be the same again. The morning sun climbed higher over 29 Palms, baking the desert sands with relentless heat. The base was alive with movement, Marines jogging in formation, vehicles rumbling across asphalt, the distant hum of helicopters conducting exercises. Yet amidst the routine, Marcus Hale could think of little else but the old man he had encountered yesterday. James Reaper Dalton, a living ghost from a past America, had tried to forget. Hale walked toward the mess hall, rifle inspection forgotten, thoughts swirling. Dalton had vanished that night, leaving only the M40, polished and gleaming like a sacred artifact. His patch, the Delta 9 insignia, haunted Hale. He had called the base records office immediately, digging for any trace of Dalton, but the files were sparse, inconsistent, and heavily redacted. The official record declared Dalton missing in action, presumed dead in 1968, yet Hale had seen him with his own eyes, alive and meticulous, as though time had only sharpened him. Hale returned to the range, hoping to find the old man again. The steel targets clanged under the rifle fire of young Marines, their bullets kicking up clouds of sand. Then, in the shadow of the far berm, he saw him, Dalton, sitting cross-legged on a small tarp, the M40 across his lap, cleaning every inch of it with ritualistic care. Hale's approach was cautious, the desert heat amplifying his sense of tension. "Reaper," Hawley called, keeping his tone firm but measured. Dalton's gaze lifted slowly, piercing yet calm. "You came back," he said simply, almost stating the obvious. "Curiosity will get you killed, Commander." Hawley ignored the warning. "You're not supposed to be here. They listed you dead 57 years ago." Dalton chuckled softly, a dry sound like sand blowing across a tin roof. "Presumed dead. Missing in action. A lot of things they tell the families, the press. None of it ever tells the truth." "Not really." The wind stirred, blowing dust across Dalton's jacket. Hawley caught a glimpse of the faded medals and Vietnam-era insignia tucked under the folds of the older uniform. How are you alive?" Hawley asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He could feel a mix of disbelief, awe, and something heavier, the weight of history pressing down on him. Dalton's hands never faltered in their work. "I survived because they didn't want me to. They left us to die so their story could be clean. My job was to remember. And now, my job is to pass it on." Hale's mind raced. Pass it on? To him? To him? He didn't know if he was ready for the truth Dalton carried, the secrets buried in jungles, the ambushes, the men who never returned home. Dalton finally set the rifle down and gestured to the targets in the distance. "You ever fire one at 900 meters? Hit the smallest steel plate, and it's not luck. It's everything you've learned: discipline, focus, patience, and the ghosts of every Marine who came before you." Hawley nodded slowly, watching Dalton's movements, the way his fingers adjusted the scope, the precise tension of the trigger. Even decades removed from the battlefield, Dalton moved with the confidence of a man who had walked through fire and survived. "You were in Delta 9, Hawley said carefully, testing the waters. "During Vietnam?" Dalton's eyes darkened, shadowed with memories. "We were ghosts, Marcus. They called us expendable. You never hear about the missions we did, because it was easier to write us off as missing. If the government pretends we don't exist, they can pretend the failure never happened." Hawley felt a chill despite the desert heat. He knew the stories of Delta 9 in legend, elite snipers sent on missions too dangerous for conventional units. Men trained to strike silently, vanish without a trace, and return with intelligence no one else could gather. But Dalton's voice told a story the history books never did, one of betrayal, abandonment, and a meticulous cover-up that spanned decades. You survived?" Hawley asked. Dalton looked down at the rifle, fingers tracing the stock as if feeling for the memories embedded in the wood. "Survived is a funny word," he said. "I didn't just survive bullets and bombs. I survived the lies, the silence, and the world forgetting us. The others?" His voice faltered, then steadied. "They didn't get that chance." Hawley took a step closer, drawn in by a mix of duty and awe. "Why here? Why now?" Dalton's gaze lifted, meeting Hale's directly. "Because the world forgets. But you don't. You carry the same patch I did. You lead the men I once led. And there's something you need to know before history repeats itself." A wave of unease swept over Hawley. History repeats itself? Dalton didn't answer immediately. He simply opened the M40's bolt and carefully examined the chamber, as though preparing for a shot only he could see. "Someone wants the truth buried, Marcus. But truth has a way of surviving, even if it has to crawl back from the grave to do it." Hale's pulse quickened. He was used to commanding men, planning missions, calculating risk. But he had never been in the presence of someone who embodied the mission itself, who carried decades of history in their gaze and hands. He realized, with a mixture of fear and fascination, that Dalton wasn't just a man. He was a living repository of Delta 9, of its victories, its failures, its secrets. Suddenly, Dalton's voice broke the silence again. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the rifle stock. Ha-Lee leaned in. Tiny scratches, etched symbols, and coordinates were carved into the wood, precise and deliberate. "These aren't just marks," Dalton said. "They're a map, a reminder of where we were left behind, where our brothers fell, where the government wanted the story buried. And now someone has to see it. Someone has to know." Hale felt a mix of awe and dread. This was no longer a chance encounter. This was a call to duty, a mission that had survived half a century, passed silently into the hands of the next generation. And he, Marcus Hale, now bore the responsibility of answering it. As the sun climbed higher, Hale and Dalton remained on the range, a silent understanding forming between them. The young Marines around them continued their drills, oblivious to the living history that had just walked into their midst. Hal realized something profound. The lessons of Delta 9 were not in the textbooks, not in the declassified files. They were in the hands, the eyes, and the resolve of those who had endured and remembered. For the first time in years, Hale felt a sense of anticipation, the kind that comes before a mission that could change everything. Dalton looked at him again, eyes piercing. "Are you ready to listen?" he asked. Hale nodded. He didn't fully understand what he was agreeing to, but he knew this was bigger than himself, bigger than any order from command. This was history, memory, and justice combined, and it had finally found its messenger. The desert wind swept across the range, stirring dust and memories alike. Two Marines, separated by generations yet united in purpose, faced the unspoken truth of Delta 9. And as the targets rang with the echoes of rifle fire, Hale knew that his life and the future of his men had just intersected with a story that refused to die. The desert sun had climbed to its zenith, casting the 29 Palms Marine Corps base in a harsh, relentless glare. Marcus Hale could barely focus on the drills or the clatter of boots on asphalt. His mind was consumed by the living ghost he had encountered, James Reaper Dalton, a man whose existence defied every record the military kept. Hale knew that to understand Dalton, he would have to confront the past, the kind of past the Marines didn't talk about and the government tried to erase. Hale returned to his office, dusty sand clinging to the soles of his boots. He shut the door, sat behind the polished mahogany desk, and opened the base record system. The screen blinked to life, displaying a sea of redacted files, classified operation logs, and photographs yellowed with age. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, as if hesitating to touch history. Then he typed in the name, James Dalton, Mia, 1968. The results were sparse. There were mentions of Delta 9, a list of commendations, and one line that made Hale lean back in his chair. Psychological evaluation incomplete after extraction failure. No further details. No record of what happened to him. No mission reports. Nothing that could explain how this man, sitting on a base 57 years later, could have survived. Hale's pulse quickened. He dug deeper, scrolling through declassified mission files and old Vietnam War archives. One operation kept appearing in fragments and whispers. Operation Silver Phantom. No full report, no confirmation of the mission's objectives, only half-letters, annotations in the margins, and faded photographs of jungle clearings. Men crouched in dense foliage, and rifles gleaming under a sun that had long since disappeared. The realization hit Hale like a sledgehammer. Dalton wasn't just a survivor. He was the last living witness to a mission, that had been deliberately erased from history. The name Silver Phantom alone sent chills down Hale's spine. Stories in the base archives spoke vaguely of Delta 9 snipers sent deep behind enemy lines, a team ambushed and lost to secrecy, a mission deemed compromised and quietly scrubbed from official records. And Dalton had not only survived, but carried the story with him, in his hands, his eyes, and that M40 sniper rifle. Unable to resist, Hawley printed the fragments he could find, photographs, faded annotations, and a single map. He spread the papers across his desk, staring at the grainy images of men in Vietnam, rifles poised, faces tense. The coordinates scribbled in Dalton's rifle stock began to make sense. They matched locations on the maps where Delta 9 operatives had disappeared. His breath caught. Dalton had left clues embedded in the rifle, a trail pointing to the truth that no one else dared to follow. The office phone rang, snapping Hawley out of his reverie. It was Captain Lennox, a colleague and trusted officer. "Hawley, are you still at your desk? Drill schedule is about to start." Hawley ran a hand through his hair. "Lennox, have you ever heard of Operation Silver Phantom?" There was silence on the other end. Then a hesitant voice. "Not officially. Commander, some things you shouldn't dig into. It's sensitive. Just focus on the deployment prep." Hawley felt a pang of frustration. Orders were orders, but truth had a way of demanding its own path. Dalton's presence at the base wasn't coincidental. He hadn't wandered in to reminisce. He had come to pass on something, a mission, a memory, a warning, and Hawley was the one chosen to receive it. He returned to the range. The midday sun turned the desert into a furnace, the targets reflecting shimmering light like distant promises. Dalton was there, crouched behind the berm, eyes scanning the horizon. Hawley approached slowly, careful to respect the old Marine space. "Dalton," Hawley began, voice low. "I looked into Silver Phantom. The files, they barely exist. Do you know why?" Dalton's gaze hardened. "Because what happened there? Someone wanted it gone. Entire sections of men, entire operations, erased from existence. But erasure doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means someone is afraid of it being remembered." Hawley watched him, captivated. Dalton's voice carried authority and pain, a mixture of duty and unresolved grief. "I know what you're thinking," Dalton continued. "I'm not here to complain about the past. I'm here to make sure someone understands it. Because history repeats itself when the truth is buried." Hawley nodded slowly, realizing that Dalton was giving him more than just a story. He was offering a lesson in vigilance, honor, and moral courage. Dalton finally gestured to the rifle. Hawley knelt beside him, noticing for the first time the intricate markings carved into the wood. Coordinates, initials, small tally marks, almost like a diary in the language of a sniper. Dalton's hands hovered over them as he spoke. "Every mark tells a story. Every bullet fired, every brother lost. And this," he tapped the barrel lightly, "this is where you start understanding what they tried to hide." For hours, Hawley and Dalton sat in silence, the young Marines on the range oblivious to the weight of history unfolding just meters away. Dalton recounted missions in cryptic phrases, enough to give Hawley context, but never the full picture. He spoke of ambushes, extraction failures, and the men who never returned. He spoke of courage under fire, and the cruelty of bureaucracy that left heroes forgotten. Then, almost casually, Dalton mentioned a moment that made Hale's stomach knot. "There was a clearing," he said, voice dropping, "where Delta 9 was ambushed. Coordinates I carved here. That's where the men I led fell, left for dead. And someone covered it up. Every officer above me pretended nothing happened. Every file disappeared. But I remember. I carry it. And now you carry it too." Hale swallowed hard, the desert heat feeling like it had grown heavier around him. The weight of responsibility pressed down, mingling with awe. He realized he wasn't just listening to a story. He was being inducted into a living memory of Delta 9, the final guardian of a mission that had defied death and secrecy. "Why me?" Hale asked, almost whispering. "Why not just leave it buried?" Dalton's eyes softened, a fleeting warmth breaking through the stoic mask. "Because you lead the same patch I did. You train the same men I once trained. You understand duty the way I do. Someone has to know, Marcus. And if it isn't you, it dies here forever." Hale nodded, gripping the edge of the rifle. He had been trained to lead, to plan, to execute. But this was a mission of a different kind. It was about memory, honor, and justice delayed. And it was now his responsibility to carry the truth forward, no matter the consequences. As the sun began to lower over the Mojave Desert, casting long shadows across the range, Hale realized something profound. Dalton's story was not just about the past. It was a warning, a legacy, and a call to action. And Marcus Hall, Marine Sniper Commander, had just accepted a mission that spanned decades, from jungle clearings in Vietnam to the desert sands of California. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy with history, grief, and the unspoken understanding that truth has a way of surviving, even when men try to bury it. Dalton returned to cleaning the rifle with methodical precision, Hale at his side, staring at the markings, the worn stock, and the weight of decades etched in metal and wood. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter lifted off, the blades slicing through the air like a reminder of the passage of time. But for Hale, time had stopped. He was no longer just a commander preparing for a routine deployment. He was the next custodian of Delta 9's secrets, the living link between forgotten heroes and the men who would one day honor their memory. As the sun dipped lower, casting the base in a golden glow, Hale made a silent vow. He would uncover the full truth of Operation Silver Phantom. He would honor the men left behind. And he would ensure that Dalton's legacy, the story of Delta 9, would never be erased again. The desert air had grown hotter as Marcus Hale returned to the range the following morning. The earlier tension lingered like a shadow, and the memory of James Reaper Dalton, the man who should have been dead 57 years ago, occupied every corner of Hale's mind. Dalton sat cross-legged beneath the shade of the berm, the M40 rifle resting across his knees like a relic of time itself. Hale approached quietly, aware that every movement was being measured. Dalton's eyes flicked up at him, piercing yet calm, as though he had been expecting this exact moment. Hale's gaze drifted to the rifle. He had studied it for hours after the previous day, tracing the tiny markings along the stock, the carved initials, the scratches, and the coordinates etched almost invisibly into the wood. Today, he decided, he would ask, and he would listen. "Dalton," Hale began, voice steady, but filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "These markings, these coordinates, what are they?" Dalton's gaze softened slightly, though the tension in his posture remained. He tapped the rifle lightly. "Every mark points to where we were left behind," he said, "where Delta 9 fell and where the truth was buried. These coordinates, they're the footprints of history they tried to erase. And now, Marcus, it's your turn to follow them." Hale knelt beside him, tracing the numbers with his finger. Each series of digits represented a specific location in the Vietnamese jungle, an area dense with foliage, narrow ravines, and hidden clearings. The very thought made his pulse quicken. "You're telling me? These are the exact spots where the ambush happened?" Dalton nodded, eyes distant, as if watching the events unfold once more. "It wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap. We were sent on a mission designed to fail. The higher-ups knew the odds, yet they sent us anyway. Delta 9 was left to die, so someone could cover their mistakes. Hale's stomach tightened. He had read reports of ambushed snipers, but the files were incomplete, censored, or outright falsified. Now, looking at Dalton, he realized he had been reading lies. How many men didn't make it? He asked quietly. Dalton's voice was flat, almost mechanical. Too many. 19 men whose names you'll never find in the official records. We were ghosts, Marcus, and ghosts don't get counted. The weight of the words sank in. Hawley thought of his own unit, of the young Marines training around them, unaware of the history etched into the rifle that Dalton cleaned with such meticulous care. He realized that history was not just a record of victories and losses. It was the memories of men who survived, of truths that refused to die. Dalton stood slowly, lifting the rifle and pointing it toward the horizon. "Look there," he said. "See those hills? Imagine them covered in jungle, thick enough to hide entire platoons. That's where the operation went wrong. We were ambushed at night. I watched my brothers fall one by one. And when extraction came, it wasn't coming for us. Not really." Hawley swallowed hard. "So they left you?" Dalton's gaze turned hard, distant. "We were expendable. Operations like Silver Phantom exist in shadows for a reason. The men in command thought if Delta 9 didn't make it, the mission could be spun into success. The world never had to know. The problem is, Marcus, the men didn't die quietly. Some of us survived, and some of us remember." Hawley could feel the history pressing down on him, heavier than the desert heat. Dalton's words were more than testimony. They were a call to action. This was not just a story of survival. It was a story of betrayal, cover-up, and the moral imperative to reveal the truth. Dalton crouched again, sliding the rifle carefully across his lap. "These coordinates aren't just locations," he continued. "They're reminders. Every place etched into this stock is a grave of men the world forgot. And now, you're going to see for yourself. If you're ready, Marcus, you'll understand why the rifle was never just a weapon. It's a map, a ledger, a witness." Hawley leaned closer, studying the markings. Each scratch, each number carved with precision, seemed almost like a heartbeat, a record of life and death encoded into the rifle's wooden stock. He realized that Dalton had been carrying this information, not just for memory, but as a moral testament. The old Marine had survived, yes, but he had also borne the weight of the mission's secrecy for decades. "Dalton, if I follow these, if I see these sites..." Hawley hesitated. "I could get in trouble. The files... The government doesn't acknowledge Silver Phantom. They've classified it beyond recognition." Dalton's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk appearing. "Some truths can't be buried, Marcus. Not if they've survived this long. Not if someone still cares enough to remember." Hawley felt a chill. The desert around them seemed suddenly still, as if even the wind held its breath. He understood now. This was more than reconnaissance or historical curiosity. Following Dalton's coordinates meant stepping into a dangerous intersection of history, morality, and authority. It meant challenging silence, risking censure, and carrying a story that many wanted to remain untold. "Then show me," Hawley said finally, his voice steady. "I want to see what Delta 9 saw. I want to understand." Dalton's expression softened, almost approving. He stood, adjusting the rifle over his shoulder. "Good. You're the first person I've trusted in a long time. Most would run at the first hint of danger. But you listen. That's why you're here." For hours, the two men moved across the range. Dalton tracing imaginary lines across the desert, explaining the meaning of each marking, the history of each ambush, the strategy and failure of missions that had been erased from official memory. Hale listened, absorbing every detail. He imagined dense Vietnamese jungles, the heat, the insects, the deadly tension of long-range sniper duels, and the quiet desperation of men abandoned by the system they served. Dalton's voice carried authority, but also grief. "You don't understand yet, Marcus," he said softly. Operation Silver Phantom wasn't just a failed mission. It was a lesson, a warning. Those in power will sacrifice lives to protect themselves. And sometimes they get away with it. But the truth, it always has a way of surviving. Hale's mind raced with questions. He knew the risks, exposure, political fallout, possible career-ending repercussions. But he also knew this was bigger than him, bigger than his unit, bigger than the base, bigger than any individual Marine. This was history itself, and it had demanded a witness. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the desert in fiery gold and orange, Dalton handed Hale the rifle. "Take it," he said. "Feel it, understand it. Let it guide you. You can't change the past, Marcus, but you can ensure it isn't forgotten. That's your mission now." Hale held the M40 carefully, marveling at the craftsmanship, the markings, and the weight of decades pressing through the stock. He realized that this rifle was more than a weapon. It was a testament, a map, a ledger of sacrifice, and a living memory of men who had vanished from the records, but never from memory. Dalton finally stood, a silhouette against the setting sun. "I've done what I could. Now it's your turn. Follow the coordinates, see the sights, and remember, the men who fell, the ones they left behind, they deserve that much." Hale nodded solemnly. The desert wind whispered across the range as if carrying voices from the past. He understood the gravity of what Dalton had entrusted to him. He was no longer just a Marine commander preparing for a routine deployment. He was a custodian of Delta IX's truth, the link between forgotten heroes and the world that had nearly erased them. As they walked back toward the base, Hale felt the enormity of the mission ahead. Following Dalton's coordinates would take him into uncharted territory, morally, historically, and perhaps even politically. But he also felt a strange sense of clarity. Some truths demand to be uncovered. Some stories demand to be heard. And this, Marcus Hale realized, was one story that refused to die. The sun had risen again over 29 Palms, casting long shadows across the desert range. The day was already hot, but for Marcus Hale, the air felt charged with tension and anticipation. He had spent countless hours thinking about James Reaper Dalton, the man who had defied time, politics, and death itself. Now, standing beside Dalton at the edge of the firing range, Hale realized this encounter was about to become more than a history lesson. It would become a training session in the art of survival, precision, and moral courage, a lesson Delta IX had mastered decades before. Dalton adjusted his faded jacket, the Delta IX patch catching the sun, and laid the M40 across a sandbag. "You don't learn to be a sniper by reading manuals," he said, voice low and deliberate. "You learn it by understanding what it means to be a Marine, to hold responsibility for every bullet, to bear the weight of every life that depends on you." Hale watched him, intrigued and slightly unnerved. The old man moved with a precision that belied his age, a legacy of decades spent in the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of the Middle East, and the shadowy corridors of covert operations. Dalton raised the rifle, demonstrating the stance, the breath control, and the micro-adjustments of the scope. "Your target isn't just the steel plate," he explained. "Your target is every mistake you've made, every man you're sworn to protect, and the truth you carry. Miss any one of those, and it costs lives." Hale lifted his own rifle, mimicking the motions. Dalton's eyes narrowed, observing, correcting. "No, Marcus. Your shoulders too tense. Your breathing is shallow. You're firing with your hands, not with your mind. The rifle is an extension of your focus, not your panic. Hours passed. The young Marines continued their drills elsewhere, unaware of the intense private lesson unfolding nearby. Hale sweated under the desert sun, muscles aching, but Dalton's voice kept him moving forward. A sniper doesn't just shoot, Dalton said. A sniper observes, anticipates, and respects the battlefield. Every leaf, every shadow, every grain of sand tells a story. And if you ignore it, that story ends badly. Hale's confidence grew slowly. Each shot landed closer to the steel targets, the rifle ringing sharply in the desert air. But it wasn't just the technique Dalton taught. It was the philosophy behind each shot, the weight of responsibility, the honor of remembering men left behind. Hale began to understand why Dalton had survived. It wasn't just skill. It was discipline, patience, and an unyielding moral compass. During a brief pause, Hale asked the question that had been nagging him. Dalton, why now? Why come here now, after all these years? Dalton's gaze softened, distant memories surfacing. Because I've carried it alone for too long, he said. The world forgot Delta 9. They left us to die in jungles they couldn't map, on missions they couldn't document. And when we survived, the truth was buried. I came here to pass it on, to ensure someone carries it forward, someone who understands duty, honor, and the cost of silence. Hale swallowed hard. The weight of Dalton's words pressed down on him. He realized that this wasn't just about learning sniper skills. It was about inheriting a burden of history, a moral obligation to the men who had fallen, and the lives that depended on memory and truth. Dalton stood and gestured toward a series of distant steel targets. We're going to push this further, he said. Long-range shooting isn't just about hitting a target. It's about reading the environment, predicting movement, and understanding the enemy and the man next to you. Delta 9 survived because we trusted our brothers and respected the battlefield. You must do the same. The next hours were grueling. Hale fired over and over, adjusting for wind, heat, and elevation. Dalton corrected his posture, his aim, his focus, each correction accompanied by a lesson in judgment, patience, and responsibility. A sniper sees what others ignore, Dalton explained. But a good sniper also knows the cost of every decision. One mistake, one lapse in awareness, and lives are lost. Remember, Marcus, the rifle doesn't kill. You do. And with that power comes duty. As the sun dipped lower, Hale finally landed a perfect shot on the smallest steel target at an extreme range. Dalton nodded approvingly. Good, he said simply. But don't let it make you proud. Pride leads to complacency. Complacency leads to failure. Remember the men you don't see, the missions no one remembers. That's who you shoot for. Hale nodded, understanding the gravity of the lesson. Each bullet wasn't just a test of skill. It was a homage to men left behind, a reminder that silence and erasure were not justice. He began to see why Dalton had survived, not through luck or cunning alone, but through an unyielding sense of purpose and honor. The desert wind stirred, carrying the faint echoes of distant helicopters and drills, blending with the silence between the two Marines. Dalton finally spoke, his tone softer but resolute. You have the skills, Marcus, but do you have the courage to use them not just for survival, but for truth? Delta 9 didn't just fight the enemy. We fought bureaucracy, indifference, and the weight of history. You must be ready for that fight too. Hale considered the words. He realized this was more than a training exercise. It was a moral initiation, a passing of the torch from a ghost of the past to a commander of the present. And he knew the stakes. Failure wasn't measured in missed shots, but in forgotten history and dishonored lives. Hours turned into evening. The sun cast long shadows over the desert, painting the range in hues of amber and red. Hawley lowered his rifle, muscles aching, sweat stinging his eyes. Dalton smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "You've learned the basics. But remember, a sniper's work never truly ends. Observation, patience, honor, truth. These are lifelong missions." Hawley exhaled, feeling both exhaustion and clarity. He understood now why Dalton had come here. It wasn't merely to teach him how to fire a rifle. It was to prepare him for the responsibility of Delta Nine's truth. To carry forward the legacy of men left behind, to protect their honor, and to confront the uncomfortable realities that bureaucracies and governments tried to hide. Dalton rose, dusting off his hands. "Tomorrow," he said, "we follow the rifle. We visit the coordinates. You'll see what Delta 9 endured. You'll understand why silence was never an option. And you'll decide whether you're ready to carry the story forward." Hawley nodded, the weight of anticipation pressing on him. He knew the next steps would challenge not only his skills, but his sense of duty, morality, and courage. He was ready, not just to fire a rifle, but to face the truth Delta 9 had fought, survived, and carried in silence for decades. As the desert sun disappeared behind their horizon, Hawley glanced at Dalton, silhouetted against the fiery sky. The old Marine's eyes gleamed with a mixture of pride and warning. Hawley realized that the man beside him was not just a teacher or a survivor. He was a guardian of history, and Marcus Heil had just accepted the responsibility to be the next in line. In that quiet desert evening, the M40 gleamed like a beacon of memory. Hawley understood that the rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a ledger of lives, a map of survival, and a testament of honor. And tomorrow, they would follow its coordinates, step into the shadows of history, and confront the truth that had been buried for decades. The desert morning brought a rare sense of stillness over 29 Palms. The heat was relentless, but for Marcus Hawley, nothing compared to the tension coiled in his chest. He had spent days training under James Reaper Dalton, learning the skills, the patience, and the discipline of a Delta 9 sniper. Yet nothing could prepare him for what Dalton had promised today, the truth of Operation Silver Phantom in its entirety. Dalton met Hawley at the edge of the range, M40 slung over his shoulder, a small satchel at his feet. The old Marine's face was unreadable, a mask forged over decades of conflict, survival, and secrecy. "Today," Dalton said, voice low and steady, "you see why they tried to bury it. The files, the evidence. All the things they claimed didn't exist. They exist, Marcus, and you're going to see them." Hawley felt a chill run down his spine. He had already pieced together fragments, the etched coordinates in the rifle, the faint references in declassified archives, and Dalton's cryptic recollections. But seeing the actual files, the original records, the mission logs and photographs, would be a confrontation with history itself. Dalton opened the satchel, revealing a small, weathered hard drive and a stack of old folders, yellowed with age. Digital backups and hard copies. "I've kept them hidden, encrypted, and physically secured for decades. It's all here. Mission orders, communications logs, personnel rosters, photographs, even the after-action reports, all scrubbed from the official archives." Hawley took a careful step closer, reverently handling the folders. Each document carried the weight of lives lost, sacrifices made, and a truth the military had tried to erase. The hard drive hung quietly, a modern vessel carrying decades-old secrets. Hawley understood immediately. This wasn't just history. This was evidence of betrayal and cover-up. Dalton began to speak, his voice low but unyielding. Operation Silver Phantom was supposed to be a reconnaissance and sniper mission deep in enemy territory. We were elite, yes, but also expendable. Command wanted results, but they didn't want to risk their men. When Delta 9 was ambushed, the mission went off the books. The men who fell were written out. Any surviving operatives, like me, were erased. Officially, we never existed. Hale's hands trembled slightly as he began examining the folders. Photographs showed Delta 9 in dense Vietnamese jungles, rifles poised, faces grim. The coordinates matched the carvings in Dalton's rifle. Logs revealed ambush reports, communications with command, and desperate pleas for extraction. And yet, every document concluded with the same chilling note. Operation scrubbed? Personnel listed as Mia or Kiar. No further reporting authorized. Dalton handed Hale the hard drive. This contains everything else: encrypted communications, internal memos, and after-action reports that prove the ambush was deliberate. Delta 9 was a pawn. But now, Marcus, the story has to be told. Hale's mind raced. Possessing this information meant career-ending risks, potential legal consequences, and political fallout. Yet the moral imperative was undeniable. The men of Delta 9 had been sacrificed for bureaucracy and secrecy, and their legacy demanded recognition. He realized that holding the hard drive was not just about history. It was about justice, honor, and truth. Dalton's expression hardened. You need to understand the danger. If anyone discovers you have this, the orders are clear. Retrieve it, destroy it, and silence anyone who knows. This is why I've survived for decades. I never trusted anyone fully until now. And even now, Marcus, you have to be careful. The higher-ups do not want this exposed. Hale felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had faced danger in training, in combat simulations, even in real deployments. But this was different. This was a moral battlefield, where revealing the truth could end his career, place him in legal jeopardy, and threaten the lives of those around him. Why show me? Hale asked. Why now? Why not keep it buried like you did all these years? Dalton's eyes softened, though the intensity remained. Because I can't fight this battle forever. I've survived by being silent, but silence is a lie. Someone has to carry the truth forward. And you understand duty, Marcus. You understand honor. You're the right man to see this through. Hale nodded slowly, the reality settling in. He was no longer just a Marine commander training with a legend. He was now the custodian of decades of secrets, entrusted with the responsibility to confront a truth that powerful men wanted buried. Dalton opened one of the folders, revealing a detailed operational map marked with ambush points, kill zones, and extraction failures. Look here, he said, pointing to one location. This is where Delta 9 was ambushed. Communications were cut, reinforcements delayed, and extraction was never meant to arrive on time. Those men died not because of the enemy, but because of calculated decisions made far from the battlefield. Hale traced the map with his finger. Each line, each mark representing men he would never meet, but whose lives now depended on him remembering. So this is the proof, he said quietly, of the betrayal. Dalton nodded. Yes, and it's only half the story. The hard drive contains communications logs, personal diaries, and even photographs showing that the mission was manipulated. Some men were deliberately left in danger to protect political interests. If the public knew, the scandal would have shaken the entire military structure. That's why it was hidden. But truth, it has a way of surviving. Hale realized the enormity of the responsibility. This wasn't just about following coordinates or hitting a target. It was about confronting a legacy of betrayal, honoring the fallen, and deciding whether to risk everything to expose the truth. Dalton placed a hand on Hale's shoulder. You have to decide, Marcus. Carrying this isn't easy. It will make enemies. It will test your loyalty, your courage, and your understanding of duty. But if you do nothing, The men who died will be forgotten forever. And that is not an option. The desert wind stirred, lifting dust into the golden morning light. Hale took a deep breath, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He understood that this mission, this moral and historical responsibility, was more dangerous than any battlefield he had ever faced. But he also knew it was the right thing to do. "I'll do it," Hale said finally, his voice steady. "I'll follow the coordinates. I'll uncover the full truth. And I'll make sure Delta 9 isn't forgotten." Dalton's eyes glimmered with relief and pride. "Good. You're ready. Tomorrow, we go to the first site. You'll see what we endured. You'll understand why Delta 9 mattered, and why the story must survive. Remember, Marcus, this is about honor, justice, and truth. And sometimes, surviving isn't enough. You have to act." Hale nodded, understanding that the days ahead would test not only his skills as a Marine commander, but his courage, integrity, and loyalty to those who had sacrificed everything. He held the hard drive and folders carefully, feeling the weight of decades of secrets and the responsibility to honor them. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert range, Hale and Dalton prepared to embark on a journey through history, a journey that would take them to the ambush sites, confront the evidence of betrayal, and bring the truth of Operation Silver Phantom into the light. Hale knew that once they began, there would be no turning back. The men of Delta 9 depended on it. The history of a forgotten mission demanded it. And the legacy of James Reaper Dalton rested in his hands. The sun had barely risen when Marcus Hale and James Reaper Dalton loaded a rugged Humvee with supplies for their journey. The desert heat had already begun to rise, painting the 29 Palms landscape in golden hues. Hale felt a mix of anticipation and unease. Today, they would leave the familiar bounds of the base and travel to the first of the coordinates etched into Dalton's M40 rifle, the physical remnants of Operation Silver Phantom. Dalton sat beside him, silent and focused, the rifle resting across his lap like a ceremonial key to a past long buried. "The first site isn't far," Dalton said, voice low, almost reverent. "But don't expect it to be empty or silent. History leaves traces, Marcus. Sometimes painful, sometimes haunting. You need to be ready to face both." Hale nodded. He gripped the wheel tightly, the weight of responsibility pressing down. Every mile they drove, he felt the growing gravity of the mission. This wasn't a training exercise, nor routine reconnaissance. They were traveling into the echoes of betrayal, the remnants of a battlefield where men had fallen and governments had chosen to forget. After hours of driving through desert and scrubland, the Humvee crested a ridge. Below, a wide expanse of untouched land stretched out, dunes, scrub, and sparse vegetation, eerily silent. Dalton's eyes scanned the terrain, sharp and precise, as if the desert itself whispered the secrets of the past. "Here," he said finally. "This is where Delta 9 was ambushed." Hale felt a chill despite the desert heat. Nothing in the photographs or logs could have prepared him for the reality of the site. Slight depressions in the earth, overgrown shrubs, and remnants of camouflage netting hidden under layers of sand. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet charged with memory. This was a battlefield that time had tried to erase. Dalton stepped out, rifle in hand, and began to survey the area. Hale followed, feeling the weight of every step. The sand crunched underfoot, each sound echoing like a heartbeat from the past. Dalton's voice broke the silence. "This is where 19 men fell," he said quietly. "Left behind because someone decided their lives weren't worth the cost of exposure. Remember that, Marcus. Every footprint, every piece of debris. It's evidence. Evidence of survival and betrayal." They moved slowly across the terrain. Dalton pointing out depressions where men had dug foxholes, fragments of rusted equipment half buried in sand, and the faint remains of a supply crate that had been airdropped during the mission. Hale traced the sites carefully, imagining the chaos that had unfolded decades ago. Ambushes under dense canopy, sniper fire cutting through the night, comrades falling silently, an extraction delayed or deliberately withheld. "See this?" Dalton said, crouching beside a small indentation in the sand. He tapped it lightly with his finger. "One of our brothers fell here. You can't see the body, but you can feel the loss. The soil remembers. The earth remembers." Hale swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. The reality of history, the lives sacrificed, and the deliberate erasure from official records pressed down on him. He felt a surge of anger and sorrow. The men of Delta 9 had been heroes, yet they were ghosts in the eyes of their own government. Dalton led him further, showing fragments of personal belongings, a helmet cracked and weathered, a compass with the glass shattered, a torn journal page buried under sand. "Every piece tells a story," Dalton said. "These weren't just soldiers. They were brothers. And they were betrayed." Hale knelt to examine a rusted canteen, faintly etched with initials. He realized he could feel the presence of men who had been left behind, a weightless yet palpable connection to the past. "How did you survive, Dalton?" he asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Dalton's gaze hardened. "Because I remembered. Because I refused to be forgotten. And because I made a promise to carry their story. Every man who fell, their memory was my mission. You're going to carry it now, Marcus. You'll see more than debris. You'll see the consequences of decisions made far from the battlefield." They continued to the next site, each step revealing more remnants, scorched earth, a partially collapsed shelter, and faint traces of trails where Delta 9 had attempted to maneuver under fire. Hale began to understand the scale of the betrayal. Not just tactical failure, but deliberate manipulation. Communications logs showed delays, extraction teams redirected, and enemy positions pre-known to command, evidence that the mission had been engineered for disaster. Dalton paused at a shallow depression, shaded by sparse scrub. "This is where I lost my brother," he said, voice almost breaking. "I had to choose, leave him or risk myself. I chose survival. I survived so someone could know the truth. And now, it's your turn to witness it." Hale felt a lump in his throat. The moral weight of survival pressed down. He realized that this mission, following Dalton's coordinates, uncovering evidence, and confronting the truth, wasn't just historical. It was a test of conscience and courage. He was not only seeing the sights, he was feeling the decisions, the sacrifices, and the betrayals that had been deliberately hidden. Dalton's tone shifted, firm and resolute. "Look around, Marcus. Every forgotten battlefield, every erased mission, every fallen brother. It's a reminder that some truths are buried because they're inconvenient. But inconvenient doesn't mean irrelevant. That's why we're here. That's why you're here." Hale nodded, absorbing the lesson. Every footstep, every artifact, every subtle imprint in the sand reinforced the enormity of responsibility he now carried. He realized the men of Delta 9 were not just ghosts. They were a living moral compass, guiding him toward accountability, honor, and action. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the desert, Dalton and Hal paused at the final coordinate for the day, a small ravine partially hidden by brush. Dalton knelt, brushing away sand to reveal the rusted frame of a rifle. "This was one of theirs," he said quietly. "Left behind because they had no one to carry the story, no one to remember them. Until now." Hale knelt beside him, taking in the magnitude of the sight. He could almost hear the echoes of gunfire, the strained breathing, the final moments of Delta Nine's brothers. It was overwhelming, but also clarifying. The men had been betrayed, yes, but their legacy had survived through Dalton. And now through Hawley. Dalton finally stood. Turning to Hawley. Tomorrow, we move to the next set of coordinates. The betrayal deepens there. You'll see decisions made in the shadows, communications destroyed, lives sacrificed. But you'll also see courage, the courage of men who refused to give up, even when the world had forgotten them. Hawley rose, muscles aching, heart heavy but resolute. He understood the stakes now, not just personal risk, but moral responsibility. The evidence was real, the betrayal undeniable, and the story demanded to be told. He knew that following Dalton's lead would take him into dangerous territory, both literally and politically. Yet the men of Delta 9, their lives, and their honor left him no choice. As the sun dipped behind the desert ridges, Hawley and Dalton prepared to return to the Humvee, carrying with them the silent weight of the forgotten battlefield. The desert was quiet now, but the air seemed charged with the memories of men who had fallen, and the moral imperative to see their story through to the light. For Marcus Hawley, the mission had evolved. It was no longer about training, observation, or reconnaissance. It was about bearing witness, confronting betrayal, and preserving the honor of Delta 9, a task that would test every skill, every moral fiber, and every ounce of courage he possessed. The rifle rested on Dalton's shoulder, glinting in the fading light, a symbol of memory, sacrifice, and the unbroken chain of duty that spanned decades. Hawley knew that the next day would bring more revelations, more truths, and perhaps more danger. But he also knew one thing with certainty. The men of Delta 9 would not be forgotten, not while he lived. The early morning sun glinted off the Humvee as Marcus Hawley and James Reaper Dalton prepared to leave for the final coordinates of Operation Silver Phantom. The desert seemed still, almost reverent, as if the land itself remembered the soldiers who had fallen decades before. Hawley felt a weight he had never known, the responsibility of history pressing on him. The hard drive and folders containing the hidden files were secured in a reinforced case, each click of the locks echoing like the ticking of a clock over lives long forgotten. Dalton sat beside him, the M40 rifle resting across his lap, silent and composed. His face was etched with years of survival, pain, and resolve. "This is it," Dalton said, voice low and measured. "The final sites. The places where the decisions that betrayed Delta 9 were made, and where the men paid the ultimate price. You need to be ready, Marcus. Once we expose this, nothing will be the same." Hall nodded, gripping the steering wheel. The stakes were no longer abstract. The men of Delta 9, the mission erased from official records, the betrayal hidden behind bureaucracy. It was all real, and he was about to confront it. He realized that exposing the truth would bring him into direct conflict with powerful figures in the military and government who wanted the story buried. Hours later, they reached a remote canyon, the terrain rugged and unwelcoming. Dalton stepped out, scanning the rocky cliffs and desert scrub. "This is where it all went wrong," he said. Delta 9 was ambushed here. Communications were cut, reinforcements delayed. Decisions made far from the battlefield determined the lives of 19 men. And yet, this land remembers. Hawley followed him carefully, observing depressions where men had taken cover, rusted equipment partially buried, and fragments of personal belongings, a helmet, a belt buckle, a torn journal page. Each item was a testament to the bravery of men erased from history. Hawley knelt, brushing away sand from one of the depressions, feeling the presence of the fallen. "It's surreal," he whispered. "To touch what's left, to see what they endured. I can't imagine the courage it took." Dalton's eyes hardened. "Courage is nothing without purpose. They fell because someone above decided their lives didn't matter. We survived because we refused to let that decision define us. And now, you carry their story forward. Hawley exhaled, absorbing the gravity of Dalton's words. For decades, the men of Delta 9 had been ghosts, erased from records, forgotten by history. But now, with the coordinates, the physical evidence, and the hidden files, Hawley had the means to bring justice to memory itself. Returning to the Humvee, they drove back to a secure location where Hawley could begin transferring the files. Dalton had prepared for this. Multiple encrypted backups, detailed logs, photographs, and even personal accounts from Delta 9 operatives who had survived the ambush. Hawley plugged in the hard drive, watching as folders appeared, each one a window into a past meticulously erased. Hours passed. Hawley pored over the files, photographs, and communications logs. He saw the planning documents, the ambush points, the delayed reinforcements, and the evidence that the mission had been engineered for failure. Each file reinforced the moral weight of what Dalton had been carrying for decades. He realized that Operation Silver Phantom was not merely a mission gone wrong. It was a deliberate act of betrayal. Dalton watched silently, letting Hawley absorb the information. "This is why it's dangerous," Dalton said finally. "Some men in power don't want this to surface. Careers, reputations, even lives could be destroyed if the truth comes out. But the truth deserves to be told. That's why we've done all this quietly, until now." Hawley nodded. "We need to make sure the right people see this. Those who can honor Delta 9 without silencing it. And the public. They need to know the men who were forgotten." Dalton's gaze hardened. "Careful, Marcus. Exposure comes at a cost. There will be resistance, threats, maybe even attempts to confiscate or destroy this evidence. But if we fail, the men who died will remain ghosts forever. You're ready, though. I can see it in you." The next weeks were tense. Hawley coordinated with select journalists, historians, and retired military officials who could safely handle the information. Every step required caution: digital security, secure transport of physical files, and clandestine meetings. The story of Delta 9 had to survive, but it also had to reach the world intact without being suppressed. Finally, Hawley gave Dalton the news. "We're ready. The files are secure, the story is drafted, and those who need to know are prepared. Tomorrow, the truth comes out." Dalton nodded, the first trace of a smile crossing his weathered face in decades. "Good. They deserve that much." The following morning, the story of Operation Silver Phantom broke across national and international news outlets. Hawley and Dalton watched from a secure location, seeing headlines that told the world of Delta 9's bravery, the deliberate ambush, and the decades-long cover-up. The photographs, documents, and survivor accounts left no doubt. The men who had fallen were no longer ghosts. Their sacrifice was finally acknowledged. Reaction was immediate and intense. Military and government officials scrambled to respond. Investigations were opened, some officers forced to answer for decisions that had led to the deaths of Delta 9 operatives. Hawley received calls from high-ranking officials, both congratulatory and cautionary. The exposure had rocked the establishment, but the moral imperative had been fulfilled. Dalton watched quietly, letting Hawley handle the fallout. "You've done well, Marcus," he said. "You carried the burden I once bore alone. You ensured Delta 9's story survived, and now you've made sure their honor is intact." Hawley felt a profound sense of relief, though tempered by the knowledge of the battles yet to come. The story had been told, but the consequences would ripple through lives, institutions, and reputations. Yet for the first time, he felt the weight of history balanced by justice and honor. Over the following weeks, memorials were held, veterans honored, and Delta 9's story integrated into military history. Hawley attended each event, often standing silently beside Dalton, feeling the presence of the men who had been forgotten. Families, historians, and fellow Marines expressed gratitude, some shedding tears for heroes they had never known existed. Dalton finally spoke to Hawley one evening, the desert sun setting behind them. "It's done," he said softly. "The truth is out. The men are remembered. The mission is no longer a secret. We've honored them." Hawley looked at him, understanding the weight of the words. "You've carried this for decades alone. I'm just glad I could help see it through." Dalton smiled faintly, the first genuine expression of peace in years. "No, Marcus, you didn't just help. You ensured Delta 9's legacy would endure. And that's worth more than anything I ever did in the field." As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Hawley and Dalton stood together in silence. The desert wind whispered across the dunes, carrying memories of bravery, sacrifice, and betrayal. The story of Delta 9, once buried and erased, now stood as a testament to honor, courage, and the unbreakable bond between Marines. Hawley held the M40 rifle, tracing the carved coordinates one last time. Each mark told a story of survival, loyalty, and moral courage. Dalton placed a hand on his shoulder. "The men are remembered, Marcus. That's all we ever wanted. You carried it well." For Hawley, the journey had begun as a mission of curiosity and training. It had evolved into a moral crusade, a confrontation with betrayal, and ultimately, a restoration of honor. The men of Delta 9 had been erased from records, but not from memory. And through the courage, diligence, and integrity of Marcus Hawley, their legacy would endure forever. The desert was quiet now, peaceful in a way that belied the violence of the past. But the echoes of Delta 9's bravery would never fade. Their story, once buried, had finally emerged, unbroken, undeniable, and eternal.